But over the past 16 years, Robert Kraig has been a leading strategist in the Wisconsin progressive movement. Dr. Kraig has appeared on MSNBC, Fox News, Al Jazeera, Democracy Now!, and many syndicated radio programs, and has been quoted in national newspapers and magazines such as the New York Times, Washington Post, the American Prospect, the Atlantic, and Mother Jones. And I hear him often on public radio being quoted as well. Has worked with some local people are familiar with him because of the programs like TIP and Wisdom, and Naomi has worked with them. So his topic tonight, why poverty is rising and the American dream is slipping away. Let's welcome Robert Kraig.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. So I just want to give you a general sense of what's going on. So, according to the Pew Charitable Trust, Wisconsin's middle class has shrunk more than any middle class in the whole country since the year 2000. And in fact, adjusted income, adjusted for inflation, has fallen by 14.7% in Wisconsin, the most of any place in the country. Now, if you notice, the timeline I just gave you is not that partisan, because there was two-term Democratic governor in that time frame, and now a governor in the middle of his second term that's Republican, and there was part of another Republican administration, a little bit of Tommy Thompson and part of Scott McCallum. So if you want to see it that way, it's a bipartisan problem that we've had this decline. Now we can debate whether or not the decline has been hastened since conservatives took power in 2010, but the fact is this is not a matter of things were all great and then Scott Walker was elected, right? That this is a longer term trend and problem. And so what Rob, back in an earlier media age, Fighting Bob LaFollette, what he used to do is, and people forget, people think that he just came and barnstormed the state. He overturned a very powerful political establishment, and Senator John Spooner, the guy whose machine was running things, was one of the four most powerful senators in the country, and was blocking Theodore Roosevelt's reforms at the turn of the century before LaFollette and his revolution overcame them. What LaFollette used to do is, he would tour the state and barnstorm, but this is a time where there was an advanced print age, what I would call it, because cities and towns didn't have one newspaper, they had lots of newspapers. I mean, Milwaukee had like 15 daily newspapers, right? And a Wausau would have had 3 or 4, I believe, back in that era. And so his speaking tours got massive press, so they were read much more than they were heard, even though a lot of people heard them. So there really was mass media, and those newspapers used to have multiple editions a day. And the Telegraph, so the fact is it was almost as quick as cable news, right? That you would have a new edition of the newspaper on a development. But what he would do is he'd go and read in each place he went the roll call vote on key bills. And he would do it very dramatically, where he would explain the bill, explain who was on the side of the lumber trust and what it did for the lumber trust and who was against the farmers and for the railroads or the lumber trust, etc. And he would dramatically read the assembly and senators in that area at the end, and build up all this drama. And of course, in most cases, they would have voted with the lumber trust or with the railroads and against the farmers, etc. And so he created this series of bright line tests and revealed to constituents throughout the state how their own senators and assembly people were not representing that problem. And if you look at the numbers in terms of from the 1960s on, in fact, you go to the 1940s on, what you see in American history, I hate PowerPoint, so I don't have to show you charts and graphs, but we moved into a period after World War II where we had the most economic equity and opportunity that we'd ever had in this country, and we built the largest middle class in human history. And so there was a period where the growth in the economy, the gains in the economy were being fairly evenly distributed. They weren't just going to the 1% or the top 0.1% of the 1%. And that was true until about the mid-1970s. That's when you see it turning around. And so, but starting in the mid-1970s, it was actually people thought in the 60s that this was the new normal. And that what it was like in the 1920s or the Gilded Age in the late 19th century, the era that led to the rise of Fighting Bob LaFollette and the attacks on trusts and large corporations, that period somehow was in the past, and now the new normal was a great middle class where the benefits of the economy were relatively evenly distributed. Now we still had a lot of problems. We still had tremendous racial inequality, gender inequality, obviously women were not getting equal pay for equal work. So I don't want to say that, say, the early mid-1970s was, you know, a utopia. And I think all of you who lived through it know it wasn't for other reasons as well. It was a highly divisive time. But economically, it was more evenly distributed than it had been before. Since then, it's gone the other way, and increasingly, most of the growth in our economy has gone not only the top 1%, but the top 0.1%. In the Great Recession, we lost, and I'll give no data on this, but it's available, and it's actually available on our website, but and this is from the major think tanks at UW Milwaukee, but we lost mostly middle class and upper income jobs during the Great Recession. So with all the job losses in Wisconsin, the decline was in the middle class and people even people above the middle class. During the quote-unquote recovery, almost all of the job growth has been in poverty wage jobs. So if you look at it, we're looking at a great transition that's going on. And there's actually no plan to scale on either side of the aisle to cope with that. So you can say that one side would do slightly more than the other, would slow down the decline, but there's nothing to scale to deal with that kind of economic transition. Now, one thing is, and I want to talk both about views of social programs, but also views of the economy, because they actually go together, and it's not just one or the other, because almost all the reforms of social programs have to do with people going into the private economy, right? And the reason people need social programs is because they're not getting the kind of jobs they need in the private economy for a variety of reasons. So one barrier is simply this idea that it's kind of an individual causation view. It is that poor people are responsible for their own poverty, and that they somehow don't have the moral fiber, they don't have the character to work their way up, and it's the Horatio Alger type story. This person made it. Ben Carson made it out of Detroit, therefore anyone growing up in poverty in Detroit can make it. It's a very simple story, it's appealing, but it's not the way the world actually works. When you have systems that produce millions and millions of people who have very little social mobility and just statistically have very little chance of getting out, it is not reasonable to say that it has to do with their moral failings or to take the one heroic individual and use that as proof that the millions of people who ended up staying in poverty when they grew up in poverty somehow just lacked moral fiber, or they weren't brilliant enough. If you're brilliance, of course, is not something, it's luck of the draw, right? So a certain number of people are going to make it from any circumstance. That does not prove the broader question that the system is fair or just. So that's why this term is being used more and more. It's even being used on the Republican side by some candidates. This idea that Elizabeth Warren came up with, that the economy, or the terminology, the economy has been rigged against average people, right? In order for it to be rigged, it has to be someone doing it, right? So it suggests the economy is something we create and something we could change. And that's what I think it's very important to talk about, whatever your solution is, to talk about the economy in that way, and not to de-people the economy. If you think about, since there's a common sense view that you can't harm business in any way, and what's good for business is good for the economy, what works against that, and it actually makes economic sense, is the idea that it's bad for the economy when people don't have enough money in their pockets to make ends meet and afford the basics, because when they can't do that, they don't spend money in the local economy, and that hurts business, and that costs jobs. When they make a decent wage, they spend money in their community, and that creates more prosperity and more jobs, okay? A lot of discussion right now in Wisconsin about there being, people heard of this skills gap? So the idea is that the problem isn't the economy, or that employers aren't providing enough jobs, as the skills of the workers, and if the workers had more skills, then they would get good jobs. Now this depends upon these good jobs being there in the first place, and unless you do the old thing of, gee, there are a lot of want ads, right? Statistically, it's not the case. There are far more people looking for jobs than having them. In addition, economists who have really dug into this, like Mark Levine at UW Milwaukee, has found that the areas that they claim there's a skills gap in, like welders, the wages haven't gone up. So if you really did have a shortage of welders, the cost of a welder would go $12, $13, $14 an hour until it brought welders in. And we actually know that in terms of other states that there are 30,000 welders in the upper Midwest, And there's a large supply of welders, so the numbers don't actually bear out the idea that there's a great shortage of welders. What it is it's companies basically whining that they can't get welders for $10 an hour, would be my description of it. And of course they can't, right? Right, exactly. And so it's more than that. I can't get them for what I want to pay them, which is very little. Not that there's actually a shortage of welders. And if you train more welders, well, there might be enough of a flood of welders to make them come in for $10 an hour without benefits. The folks from Applebee's came in and testified against it, and they pointed out they were building, all these Applebee's all over the state. There were going to be 12 more in the next year or something like that. And if they raised the tip minimum wage, that we wouldn't have as nearly as many Applebee's being built. And so Senator Baumgart said, how many Applebee's can we have if the tip minimum wage was zero? And very stiffly, we're not arguing for zero. 233 goes, I understand, but if 233 gets us all these Applebee's, how many more can we have? Which is absolutely a great question. We can do tons of support for large corporations through WEDEC, as long as that's part of the plan, and we're using the investments in a way that helps the most people. Because at the end of the day, if you want to take the view of the free market in this country seriously, I don't even think conservatives believe that any company has a right to public money per se. And why would one company get it and another not? Why would a larger company in a business get it and not a small business, right? That the only rationale or justification there is for doing that is that it advances the common good, that it creates more opportunity for more people, so that more people have the ability to move up the economic scale, to live a life where they get to live it to the fullest and can determine their own course for themselves and their families.
But one of the things that's going to scare people away from anything like this is government takeover, socialism. I mean, even a common goal. It's going to be viewed and could be reflected, as you just said. Now they're telling you what to do. Now they're telling you, etc. But another thing that was reflected through most of what you said was the total emphasis on the supply side. Totally. I mean, even though you're arguing in favor of things that I greatly support, one of the things that I think we can do, and even just conversations with people, and can be done throughout the system, is to emphasize demand side. I mean, it's pretty hard. What you were talking about with these people, the Badger meter guy and all of that, aggregate demand is what we're talking about as economists.
Yep.
Aggregate demand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sales when you get down to the street level, is what it is. And if there's enough sales, there will be a need for jobs. So but now we're starting to continuously talk about demand for labor, demand for goods, demands for services. And I think if we, all of us, including you and everybody else who has anything to say, emphasize demand, that would be a way to penetrate this anti-person, it's socialism, you know what I mean? We can't agree, we can't do broad brush anything. Aggregate demand, I think.
You must have wondered why this fit in with AEW. Well, it does, because AEW's focus is on equality for women and girls. And you might want to speak a little bit to that. And if you want to go to AEW.org, you can get information as well. And we know that there's inequity there.
I heard a speaker in D.C. a couple weeks ago who talked about about how much women are working more and how many of them are breadwinners now than they were 40 years ago. And she said, just imagine if they were paid equal pay for equal work, how much more, But obviously a lot of women end up, these poor families we're talking about when we talk about child poverty going up are often headed by women. And so clearly that's a huge part of poverty. And then there's the question of equal pay for equal work. And there's also the question of, we still have a real problem with women-dominated professions being less well paid, right? So the reason there's so much pressure, say, on teachers' pay, I think, like it's somehow a good idea to cut the pay and benefits of teachers, is because considered a female profession. You don't see that being done to, say, male-dominated professions, like doctors, for example, who no one talks about cutting the pay of, just for example, right? Even though there are a lot more women doctors and there are plenty of male teachers, it's the predominant, same with nurses, for example.
And secretaries.
Yeah, secretaries, yeah. So even equal pay for equal work, there's also the valuing of work. So caregiving work, like childcare, like home care, which women, we undervalue that. And so we think being something like an insurance broker is a more important job than taking care of frail elderly and keeping them independent in their homes. I don't see why any social value system, why that would be the case.